Hello, Rashonda here. We are making our way through Hagar's Daughter by Pauline Hopkins. We are on chapter 16, The Spider's Web. The first dance after supper. I'm glad this is where we are. Okay, the first dance after supper Jewel had given to General Benson. A short Elysium at last for me, whispered the gallant general as he passed his arm about her slight form. Jewel was a Western girl with all the independence that the term implies. She glanced up at her partner as they whirled away, with a little amused smile, slightly sarcastic. I expected something different from you, something at least original. Good for you, Jewel. Well, it is Elysium to find one step perfectly duplicated. Oh, that is easy where one's partner is master of the art as you are. I imagine that you are one of the best dancers here. You were fond of dancing? Asked the general after a silence. Yes, that weakness was born with me. In the tremendous crowd, I could not judge, but I can speak from this waltz. You dance like a fairy. Are you pleased with Washington? Oh, yes, but I miss the freedom of the ranch, the wild flight at dawn over the prairie and the saddle, and many other things. He looked at her with glowing eyes. There we have congenial tastes. I am never so happy as when in the saddle. The ballroom was a whirl of fair faces and dazzling toilettes. The light, the heat, the perfume, almost oppressive. Knowing himself to be a fascinating conversationalist, I guess you know what you know of yourself. Knowing himself to be a fascinating conversationalist, he took advantage of a pause in the music to speak of the heat and suggest a turn in the conservatory where he knew that he could exert this power of enchantment. Okay. Jewel was nothing loth. They stood a moment before taking seats at an open glass door, gazing out on the gardens, seared and withered and covered in places with patches of snow, but bathed in moonlight. There was something solemn in the scene. Merriment seemed out of place. Even soft laughter jarred on the nerves. She looked up to the heavens, where the Southern Cross shone in all its brilliancy, surrounded by myriads of other stars. The glorious southern moon rode high in the sky. The flutes and viols were pouring out their maddest music. How glorious, Jewel said softly. Ay, glorious indeed. I mean the moon, she said. So even in like 1900, we have the scene like from the romance novel where the woman's looking out upon nature and it's like, it's so beautiful. And the man is looking at the woman and says, it is. Okay. How glorious, Jewel said softly. A, glorious. And I like A, because like we say A all the time now. A. A. I mean, maybe it's I. A. Glorious indeed. I mean the moon, she said. I mean your eyes, fair lady. You will persist in saying pretty things, General, she replied, turning away indifferently. The general bit his lip in vexation. It was not to be easy work, that was plain. There was a subdued murmur of voices and sometimes a ripple of laughter, for many couples stood or strolled about the extensive greenhouses. They were lighted softly from the arched dome by silvery lamps. Fountains flashed scented waters into marble basins where aquatic plants of strange beauty had found a home. Leading from the main conservatory were many arbors and grottos, transformed for the time being by draperies of asparagus vines and roses into a charming solitude for two. The cool stillness was refreshing after the head of the ballroom. Really, this is well done, remarked the general, stopping to admire the effect. None of the balls I have attended in Washington was so beautiful. Another compliment, General? It is not flattery, to speak the truth. They seated themselves on a rustic chair for two, and the general entertained her with tales of his travels in Italy and India, and cyclone and typhoon, and all very fascinating to the girl before whom life was just opening. Were you long out of the United States, General? About 10 years, he replied, looking down. It was this way, Miss Jewel. I was a hot-blooded young fellow who could see no wrong in the decision of his section to secede from the Union of States, and so when it all ended disastrously, I gathered together what remained of my shattered fortunes and went abroad until the pain of recollection should be somewhat dimmed. I returned almost a foreigner. Wow. I was a hot-blooded young fellow who could see no wrong in the decision of his section to secede from the Union of States, and so when it all ended disastrously, I gathered together what remained of my shattered fortunes and went abroad until the pain of recollection should be somewhat dimmed. I returned almost a foreigner. That is really interesting to me. I mean, okay, so he's like, I'm from the South. I thought the secession was right, and the Civil War did not turn out the way that I wanted. And there were, thousands, millions of people walking around who believed that. But he says it with a sense of, but I've come to believe other things. Like I'm intrigued by the wording of this, and like we have no tone for it. So it's just from the words that I felt that. I love words. Ah, she said with a gentle sigh of pity, how dreadful that time must have been. Thank heaven, ours is a united country once more. And you are mistaken, too, in your judgment. We have no foreigners here. We have effaced the world by assimilation. So, too, we have no Southerners. We are Americans. Maybe that's one of the most naive things I've ever heard in my whole life. Thank heaven, ours is a united country once more. Naivete number one. You are mistaken. Just calling somebody out. Naivete number two, in your judgment. We have no foreigners here. Naivete number three, we have effaced the word by assimilation. We have attempted to efface the word by assimilation, and assimilation is not the better word of the pair. So, too, we have no Southerners. I don't know how many naivetes I'm on. Is that four? We are Americans. That is correct, though. We are Americans. I wish we all could act like it. And I'm not saying we all have to be the same. Psh, how boring that would be. God didn't create us differently for us all to pretend that we're the same. But Americans, like I'm an American, and I definitely identify as that. And it makes me sad that some people might look at me and think, Psh, she's not a real American. Yeah, I am. And I've not been abroad much, but when I have been, it was glaring that I was an American. It was like, wow, there goes an American right there. And it wasn't glaring in a good way either, I might add. Anyway, I've digressed. The general accented her remark by a courtly bow, and then he drifted into an animated description of a sail down the Mediterranean Sea. Jewel could imagine that she inhaled the odor from boatloads of violets brought to her senses by his wonderful descriptive powers. At this moment, their enjoyable tete a tete was interrupted by the sound of a woman's voice in passionate pleading. And then we have, I don't, can you see it? We have stars right here showing that there's a break in the action and we're moving to something new. Oh, look, you can see one of my notes. I think that said how naive. Yes, it says how naive. Early in the evening, Aurelia Madison had whispered to General Benson, if you can, take Jewel into the conservatory after supper. I shall have something interesting for her to hear. How are you getting on? Any progress? Wait, was her answer. After supper, Sumner went to her to claim his dance. It was a duty dance and a painful one, he found it. As they floated down the long room, Aurelia gazed up at him with flushed cheeks and glittering eyes. She had taken a great fancy to Jewel Bowen, not only because the latter was very kind to her, kinder than anyone had ever been to her in her lonely, reckless life, but because she really carried in her heart a spark of what passed for love and which would have developed but for Sumner. Oh, that's interesting. So Aurelia at least says she feels for Jewel because Jewel has the spark of real love in her, but that Sumner's not the one to bring that real love to fruition. That's how I understood that. That's interesting. So she here is Aurelia. She could even admire Jewel's beauty without jealousy. She did not envy her wealth, although so pinched herself in money matters, and yet, strange nature of women, or of some women, for that reason she was the more determined to triumph over her as a woman, and if she could, stab her. She had forced the friendship with that intention. That's so sad. There are lots of people in the world like that, but wow, that's just so sad. So sad in so many ways. Like, you're not this person's real friend and she is offering you true friendship, but so sad that you are going through life that you feel like you can't actually have a friendship. That's the greater sadness to me. Wow. She being Aurelia, she felt instinctively that Cuthbert shrank from allowing a continuance of the intimacy between them, and she resented it. Yes, she would have her fling her triumph. Jules should know beyond a doubt that Cuthbert Sumner and his fortune was hers, belonged to her, Aurelia Madison. Now she watched his face and resented his cold, preoccupied air. How quiet you are. Aren't you well? Never better, he replied with an apology for his seeming indifference. After all, she was a woman, and a beautiful one. Why should he try to mar her favorable reception among the elite? Only I am not Jewel. Is that it? Pardon. Let us speak of something else. Shall I take you to have some refreshment? He said coldly. Oh, let us go to the conservatory. I want air and rest, she said, slipping her hand through his arm. I have seen nothing of you all evening. Now you must devote a short time to me. Her air was bolder than Sumner had ever noticed before. He bowed low in acquiescence, though he would willingly have left her there. She bit her lip, and a dogged look came into her face that was not pleasant to see, and in her heart she felt that she could take the strong, handsome man and dash him senseless at her feet. She hid her feelings well and glanced up at him with a pretty pleading look. Oh, Bert, I keep forgetting. Of course. Then she broke suddenly. I wish you loved her less. A useless wish, said Sumner coldly. Happen what may, Jewel must always be my first thought. Hi, your best and okay, so this word literally is A-Y-E. So the other one was A, it was just A-Y. Okay. Your best and truest love, she said through her teeth. They were in the deserted conservatory where all was coolness and shadow. Sumner walked by her side until they reached one of the grottos, where from between the folds of the rose-curtained drapery, a rustic seat held its inviting arms toward them. Aurelia dropped upon it. I am afraid I can't give you many minutes, he said with a cool smile. Senator Bowen naturally expects me to assist him in looking after the guests. The band was playing divinely, and the notes came to them in waves of undulating melody. Sumner never forgot that night, and the music of the band haunted him ever after. She sat there in a sad languor that would have touched any heart but his. They talked a moment of indifferent subjects, then he arose and offered his arm with a motion that indicated a return to the ballroom. But with a low and exceedingly bitter cry, she stood up. Must we part like this? My God, I cannot bear it. Have you no mercy, no pity? The tears were streaming down her cheeks. She held out her hands imploringly. With deepest sympathy and pity, he took them in his. Aurelia, you will forget. Believe me, dear, you will forget all this in a very little while. What good would my love do you now? It could bring you nothing but sorrow. We must forget each other. I know you will be happy yet. God be with you, dear girl. He bent down and pressed his lips to her trembling hands, feeling himself a wretch for bringing sorrow to this beautiful woman who loved him so. But she flung her arms about him and clung to him in desperation and the abandonment of grief, sobbing hysterically with low, quivering moans that cut him to the heart. Aurelia, do not weep so. It is torture for me to hear you. I hope I may die. Oh, if only I could. She sobbed, faltering and shivering and clinging to him, and he put his arms about her and kissed her twice on the brow. Her lovely wet face was pressed close against his cheek. A deep sigh startled him. He lifted his head. Standing in the doorway of the curtained recess, pallid as a ghost, all the graceful beauty gone from her wan face, with frightened, woeful eyes and despair in every feature, stood Jewel. With a loud exclamation, with rage and impatience and disgust, he shook the exquisite form from his bosom. To be continued. Mm. Well, this is a soap opera if ever I've seen one. I'm loving it. I don't like soap operas on TV, but I'm digging this book. So, that what chapter was that? That was chapter 16. So, until next time.